He had not smiled in 20 years. Not in the glossy magazines with his profile beneath stern headlines, not even in public ceremonies where photographers waited for any crack in the marble, not even when another company's CEO complimented his quarterly numbers. Shiyan's face was a study in restraint. High cheekbones, a jaw that did not soften, eyes that measured everything like a balance sheet. The rumor inside the conglomerate said he had once been capable of warmth. The rumor outside the glass towers said warmth had been an expensive, private item he no longer purchased. Around him, people spoke in short sentences and halting pleasantries, because the wrong word could be recorded and the wrong smile could be mistaken for weakness. On the other side of the city, Jian Yao's life ran on narrower rails and softer clocks. Her days began with the particular symphony of a small apartment, the hiss of a kettle, the rasp of a zipper tugged open to reveal a daughter's dress for the day, the gentle choreography of making 2 bowls of something that could pass for breakfast. Xiao Ran, 5 and earnest, had a laugh like a small bell and a stubborn insistence on wearing mismatched socks because, she explained, they feel like 2 best friends. Jian Yao would smile at that, then rush to button a coat with one hand and scoop up a backpack with the other. She carried the world in a satchel that had frayed at its corners and held receipts for bus fares, a pencil-chewed sketch of a coat she could not yet make, and a pocket of emergency tissues. Jian Yao designed. She took patterns and whispers and turned them into garments that made people forget sharp corners. She worked long hours on the 5th floor of a mid-sized textile firm that supplied boutiques uptown. Design meetings were supposed to be about fabric choices, about the right cut for a sleeve that would flutter instead of fall. Instead, sometimes they were about her, the single mother with the loud laugh, whose hands were stained occasionally with dye from sample runs, the woman who took her lunch in 10-minute intervals between parent-teacher conferences. Colleagues composed polite questions as if every personal fact were a scandal waiting to be televised. How does she manage? They wondered behind cupped hands. Isn't it so difficult? They said in tones that mingled pity with the easy assumption that difficulty equaled lack. Jian Yao answered with work. She drew until the lines on paper looked like breath, until sleeves could be altered in the heady dark of the sewing room to fit a model who would never know the woman who imagined them. She answered with efficiency and with a refusal to let her private life pollute her public competence. But there were microaggressions that accumulated like dust. Invitations forgotten, shifts assigned on the weekend, a designer's name called when a larger client wanted a hand. Manager Shen Shua was fair when her mood suited him, otherwise the sort who measured employees in neat margins. Assistant Ye sometimes slid notes down that hinted at fundraising balls and appropriate backgrounds. Gossip crept like ivy up the partitions. At home, there were other measures of success. Jiao Ran's homework was often more important than a meeting. Bedtime stories were written in 5-minute chapters between washing the dishes and falling asleep with a sketchbook on the chest. Once, when a drain clogged and the walls sullenly smelled of old water for a week, Jian Yao laughed and told Jiao Ran they were seasoning the apartment. The girl had laughed back because it seemed to her life that the best jokes were the ones that had to be invented. The Gu family, meanwhile, lived in a different grammar. Their house on the hill was not grand in the ways catalogs liked, it was ancient in lineage. The matriarch, Madame Gu, kept portraits that looked like they had been birthed from the past and never grew old. She policed likenesses and legacies. In the family room, she could point out faces where others saw only ancestors. She scanned crowds with the patience of a woman who had uprighted empires. She had been looking for a long time, an heir misplaced by some fault of time or fortune, a child whose presence could stitch something back together. She gave staff charts of possible neighborhoods where the child might be found and instructed lawyers to send inquiries. Her orders set a small machine in motion, a handful of aides, a driver who knew every alley leading away from downtown, a driver who could follow a tip without question. Shiyan did not engage in the search theatrically. He delegated, as a good officer invests power in others. When he stepped into the glass and steel lobby of a research institute or into a quiet gallery where the city's wealthy discussed new developments, his face remained the same, calm, summative, like a judge who had learned to keep mercy pocketed. Inside, however, his attention had started to collect small details, like a man who listened to a piano and then remembered the tune days later. A nurse's soft complaint about an unpaid bill here, a child's shoe left behind near a courthouse that caught his eye the way a misplaced chess piece catches a player's suspicion. Little things. They had begun to form a constellation behind his stern look. The chance that morning was a small, ordinary violence, which made it more dangerous. Jian Yao and Xiao Ran were returning from the market with a bag of fruit and a plastic toy Xiao Ran had bargained for with saved coins. The mall was full of weekend light, the glass atrium throwing a white clarity over places where people compared prices aloud. A group of teenagers clustered near an escalator, jackets slung like flags. They were the sort who could look a child over and call it sport.
One of them noticed Xiao Ran's toy, a tiny plastic rabbit whose painted smile was already nicked, and with the cruel economy of the thoughtless, snatched it and tossed it across the atrium. Xiao Ran's face collapsed into the small, quick grief of a child who has not yet learned how to store sadness for patience's sake. "My rabbit," she said, and then her voice rose in the way that makes you impossible to ignore. "That's not yours," another laughed. "Buy your own." Jian Yao moved before she thought. Part of it was adrenaline, part of it was an internal registry, not about possessions at all, but about the message that would be delivered to her daughter, that the world could be taken by those who had no respect for hands that had to earn everything. Jian Yao's satchel thumped against her hip as she ran. She didn't tackle or shout until first contact. She ran because in the act of moving, she might be able to reach the toy, to stop the lesson of helplessness. The teens scattered at the sight of a woman sprinting, groups thin at confrontation. One of them, indolent and sure he was protected by 3 friends, bolted. Jian Yao was faster than they expected. She did not catch him by the collar, she cornered him with a block of her shoulder, and then she spoke, low and hard in the mall's dome. "Give it back." He balked, the bravado eaten by someone so obviously unafraid. One of the teens pushed past her, more gesture than force, and one of their hands snagged at Xiao Ran's sleeve. Xiao Ran, who had been frozen on the edge of the crowd, felt her mother's presence like a warm tide pushing back. Jian Yao scooped the rabbit up and held it to her chest, as if the toy were fragile heat. The scene was ordinary until someone noticed the composition of light. A woman with a child's toy, a group of boys, a crowd that admired her like a small impromptu jury. People pulled out phones. A video began to stitch itself together, a 2-minute clip that would later be shared with commentary and heart emojis. From across the atrium, under the glass, a black sedan idled at the curb. Xiyan's driver had taken a wrong turn chasing a lead and paused because the traffic light obliged. He had stepped out of the car intending only to check a phone message when the sudden movement caught him. The sight of the woman running, the audacity, the clean line of her motion pulled his attention like a magnet. He watched as she retrieved the toy, not by force, but by presence, how she stood between her child and the world like a low wall. Her laugh afterward was not a dramatic coda so much as a breath, part relief, part attempt to reassure. She made a joke to her daughter about the rabbit being on an adventure. Xiao Ran laughed, clutching the toy. Gu's face, so practiced at neutral, shifted imperceptibly. It was a small release, a soft, near smile that barely moved his mouth, and yet when it registered in the crowd beside him, they felt it like the first thaw of a late frost.
He did not clap or shout or make an entrance. He simply put his phone away and watched until the family drifted off, blending into the crowd that fed on its own business.
The smile stayed with him. It nested in the hollow of his sternness like a foreign coin he did not yet trust. Later, some would say the smile was nothing, a rippling error of muscles. Some would say he was merely amused. But faces remember what people do. His remembered the way the woman had filled a small space with a fierce, private gentleness. He noticed that she moved toward the service elevator rather than the main one, an economy of motion that suggested she had places to be besides the mall, perhaps a day job and a child's afternoon nap on the edge of an exhausted schedule. In the days that followed, the clip circulated beyond the mall. In the company where banalities metastasized into gossip, someone had posted the video. It began as a ripple on the lunchroom chat. Watch the lady who chased the kids. Heroic. Hearts and short messages multiplied. That's mom strength right there. Jian Yao discovered the clip the way most people find their unplanned fame. Someone in the sewing room tapped her shoulder, phone held out like an offering. Have you seen this? Assistant Lee's face was a mixture, hesitation braided with an odd kind of admiration. Jian Yao watched herself on a tiny screen. She saw the way she had moved, the way her hair had snapped from the motion, the dust that had fluttered when a boy took an embarrassed step back. She saw the brief flash when someone had said something like, "Look at her, she stands up for her." There was no caption about men of industry watching, no note about stoic patriarchs cracking smiles. Her life was the life she lived, smaller, uneven, and at times intersecting with strangers who briefly held their breath. But the clip did something else, too. It hardened the view of those who were already looking for fault. In the office, a murmuration of colleagues leaned a bit further into gossip. People like that have sloppy lives, someone said, and because it was said in front of a few ears, it became a fact. A client opined that single mothers were poor investments because of parental instability, an ignorant calculus that never took into account talent or the texture of character. Manager Shiyan passed a note to HR about work reliability concerns after a shift assignment where Jian Yao had asked to leave early for a school event. The notes multiplied like a slow-growing frost. She had other things to care for. Ran came down with a cough that was not alarming at first. It sounded like a small breeze caught in the chest, a dry thing that made the child's voice slightly croaky. Jian Yao made tea and wrapped blankets around the girl's feet and took her to the neighborhood clinic, where a nurse frowned and asked if Ran had eaten dairy that day. Jian Yao's face tightened.
She remembered that Ran's eyes sometimes watered if she had milk. At 5, the girl had inherited from her grandfather an intolerance that could tip into a dangerous reaction if the wrong amount was consumed. On a Thursday afternoon, at a daycare across the street from the office where Jian Yao had left her to finish a deadline, a well-meaning caregiver handed Ran a little cup of yogurt as a treat. It was the kind of thoughtful mistake that fills the memory of a small family with guilt later. Ran took a few spoonfuls, and then, like a frothing kettle, she began to cough. At first, it was a funny, surprised cough that made her look like she had swallowed a secret. Then, the cough deepened into a rattle. Her face flushed. Jian Yao's chest closed as if someone had tightened a band around it. The woman at the center of so many quiet compromises turned into a tunnel of efficiency and fear. She guided Ran outside, under the orange light of the lampposts, and called the clinic with hands that trembled. She spoke in short, decisive sentences, and then ran, with the plastic bag of forgotten lunches thumping against her hip, toward the taxi stand. People parted for her in a way cities sometimes do, a human seam that opens for a woman who cares too fiercely for something fragile. At the hospital, the waiting room smelled sterile and expectant. Jian Yao filled out forms with a pen that left its cap somewhere near her shoelaces.
Nurses moved with professional calm. Xiao Ran sat on the small chair with a smallness that made the room tilt. She held the rabbit close, even now. Her cough was a thing that yanked at Jian Yao's throat like an improvised hook. The doctor said the word that had shaped their lives gently, allergic reaction, and then asked a string of questions. How much had she eaten? Any prior incidents? Family history? Jian Yao answered in a voice that shaved off parts of itself, rapid, precise, the way someone who has practiced being lucid in crisis would sound. They gave Xiao Ran a dose of medication to calm the swelling, an antihistamine that would settle the throat and buy time. The doctor, a steady woman with years folded into her expression, advised observation, suggested tests if symptoms recurred. Jian Yao stood by while the nurses checked the child's vitals. The beeping of the monitor became a small metronome that measured the hours in a hospital room. Phones still worked in hospitals. Jian Yao's screen lit with messages. One was an Assistant Yi, terse and shrewd. There are murmurs at work. HR is asking for a summary of days missed. Keep receipts. Another was a video link. The mall clip had risen again, now captioned by a local vlogger as "Mother's Courage Caught on Camera." Her cheeks warmed. She felt exposed in some absurd private way, like a person whose laundry had been folded and left outside to see the stains. Less visible, an envelope arrived at the hospital for "the family of Xiao Ran," a discreet brand-stamped folder that was delivered by a driver with a neutral face. Inside was a small card from an anonymous donor covering immediate medical expenses and a note that read, "For the child's care, wishing a quick recovery." It was signed with initials that meant nothing to Jian Yao, GS. The folder contained, too, a printed note stating that someone from an affiliated company had called to offer a referral to a pediatric specialist should she need one. Jian Yao folded the card into the pocket of her coat and did not cry. She folded things inward because they were tasks. Crying would be a luxury she could not endorse in front of Xiao Ran, at least not yet. The gesture made her oddly aware of the building angles of the Gu family's reach, of a hand that could ease a bill without being seen. It was both a relief and a kind of dangerous humility. She had always taken help in the precise amounts she judged acceptable, not so much that it bent her resolve, not so little that it left her drowning. Shiyan, weeks later in his private office lined with evidence of a life that did not require explanation, would sometimes think back to small things that did not fit the ledger. The woman's laugh after the mall chase, the child who clung to a rabbit, a name on a card signed with initials. He kept his distance because he understood the arithmetic of influence. One gesture could create expectation, and expectation brought complications. Yet he also noticed how the office around him had begun to react to trivialities with a sharper edge. A CEO who looks sympathetic is a liability. A CEO who does not is merely competent. He had decided early on that the company's face should be as unyielding as the balance sheet. But you cannot unsee a person who steps forward in the world's tiny injustices. It sets a weight on your sternum that is not easily removed. The hospital discharged them with instructions and a small paper bag containing enough medication for a few days. The sun outside the emergency room was bright in the way that made every leaf look like it had something to say. Xiao Ran was quieter than usual, her small cheeks flushed but settled. She held the toy rabbit like someone holding a talisman. She told her mother in a voice that filtered fear through the sugar of a child's resilience that she had liked the taste of the yogurt. Jian Yao kissed her forehead and said, "We'll be more careful." Back at the office, gossip hardened into a movement. Manager Shen saw his chance to reinforce the lines he liked: authority, old values, those who fit and those who didn't. He charted attendance and whispered that single parents were a HR headache, a phrase that floated into the ears of executives like a small oil slick. The design team began to feel the pressure. Where weakness appeared, people often walked faster to avoid stepping in it. Among the colleagues, Lin Zhao watched with particular interest. She had a complicated map in her own heart, ambition braided with insecurity. Lin had been raised in a household where marriages were conduits and kindness was an exchange. She and Jian Yao had once shared a cigarette behind the building when they were younger, trading secrets about stolen fabric and love that lasted exactly a summer. Now she found it easier to scoff at Jian Yao's compromises than to remember how hard it had been to choose. At the same time, another current gathered. People who admired the video's blunt honesty. A junior copywriter named Xiao Ming, who had always had a soft spot for underdogs, wrote an op-ed for a small lifestyle outlet about the woman who chased the kids and what it meant to parent in a fractured city. The post circulated, warm with short sentences and a few perfect photographs. A local volunteer group contacted Jian Yao, offering support and, later, a small fund to help with childcare on days when her deadlines made fists of hours. The world, as it tends to, made room for both sting and balm. The Gu matriarch, Madame Gu, learned about the hospital visit through channels that had nothing to do with sympathy. She received a plain report from her aides. A child matching a description had been located briefly at a clinic. The family seemed precarious. Her interest was not in the child's medical chart so much as in faces. How much of the family's line presented itself in a child's cheekbones, in the slope of a nose? She called an archivist who specialized in family portraits and asked for a rendering of resemblance across generations. Her voice, when she spoke into the receiver, was precise as a scalpel. "Find me a likeness worth taking seriously," she said. She did not act immediately. She had learned the usefulness of waiting. When the news had once moved too fast for her, when a marriage had been arranged before she had seen the pair's expressions at dinner, she had felt the price of haste. This time she would let others run, gather, and make mistakes. She reserved judgment as a method. When she did speak, her words carried the weight of an accusation. Meanwhile, in the small, cluttered evening world Jian Yao returned to after the hospital, there were small victories. Xiao Ran slept through the night without coughing. Jian Yao marked down the doses of medication on a scrap of paper and pinned it above the kettle. She allowed herself to fold the unknowns like laundry, stacking them in the basket for another day. The kindness of a card in a folder still smelled like a dangerous kindness. She had no appetite for dynasties or for embedded power. She wanted warm food and steady rent, and work that honored her name if it could. At the design firm, the day-to-day grinding resumed with an abrasive resume of new orders. The company had been contracted by a boutique for a fall line, and the deadline moved like a tide that made everything urgent. Jian Yao threw herself into patterns and fabric choices, stretched across a communal table like a woman who understood how to make given hours do heavy work. The team warped itself around the client's picky needs. Nights blurred into sketches. At 2 a.m., the refrigerator hummed with fatigue and cold air, and Jian Yao's hands moved with the practiced certainty of someone who had managed to sew up love into sleeves often patched on invisible seams. One evening, late, when the floor was nearly empty and the city outside had thinned into a shimmer of headlights, a younger designer lingered to ask her a question about a draft. He was earnest in a way that disarmed. He described a sleeve that would flutter in wind like the year they had sprung for a boat ride. They talked quietly about proportion, about the way fabric could comfort a person by being the right kind of shape. He mentioned the mall clip. "People were talking about you," he said, not unkindly. "People always talk," Jian Yao answered, and there was both a small laugh and a tiredness that threaded through it. The two of them folded into a conversation about craft and about guarantees that never truly exist, until the lights blinked over the floor and both moved to leave. Outside, the city had cooled into a more honest temperature. As she walked the street toward the bus stop, Jian Yao could not know that in another part of the city, someone whose face rarely changed had not forgotten the way she had stepped forward in the shopping mall. He could not know that this small memory had glued itself to his sternness and would eventually move him, slowly, toward actions no one would call theatrical, but which might, little by little, alter the way decisions were made in his name. They were still small cogs in different machines, one family threading its past through portraits, one woman stitching her life to the hems of designs, a child who learned that mothers mentioned a quiet promise, "If someone hurts you, I will get you back every time," and took it as an oath. The city kept turning, indifferent and full of accidents that make stories. The mall clip lived in the nether zone between virality and the next forgotten thing, but something else was beginning to assemble, lines of attention that would cross, collide, and rearrange. That night, Xiaoran dreamed of the rabbit making a long journey back to her, of skipping across puddles and carrying a note that said, "For those who run." She slept with the toy tucked under her arm, and when she woke, she braided her hair with the kind of determined curiosity children have, that anything can be fixed with a plan and 2 pieces of string. The morning after the hospital visit, a man in a dark suit, the kind with no unnecessary stitches, called Jian Yao's office and asked to speak to her. Assistant Ye handed the line over with the air of someone delivering a letter sealed with consequences. Jian Yao accepted.
A voice on the phone offered, in careful increments, a suggestion, a pediatrician referral, a voucher for a pill that might be costly, an invitation to speak with someone who wished to remain anonymous. Jian Yao hesitated. Help, she had learned, almost always made demands. She also knew what it cost to refuse what someone placed before her when it would ease a child's breathing. She accepted the referral because the cost of saying no to help when a child needed it felt, in that moment, like a kind of cruelty she could not justify. In the corner of the city where the Gu family maintained an unadorned power, the matriarch slid her hands across the back of a portrait and thought about the ways identities are kept and lost. She made a note to send a driver to the neighborhood where they'd last seen the family, to have a man stop by the small design firm and ask for more detail. She did not demand immediate action. She preferred patience sown with pressure. A file was opened with Xiaoran's name and the thin, stubborn note of the rabbit clipped to the folder like a childish charm. There was a sense beginning to hum in the undercurrent, a chain of small decisions that, like a pattern on a loom, could be pulled to change the whole garment. A man who rarely smiled had found himself smiling twice in small measures. A woman who had always had to make her own warmth had found it offered in an envelope with anonymous initials. The city kept its ordinary pace, but where ordinary met extraordinary, at the mall, in a hospital corridor, in the margin of a family's ledger, new shapes began to form. They would not be tidy, they would not rescue everything, they would, at certain future moments, ask for choices that cut sharper than any fabric she had ever worked. For now, the pieces were only beginning to edge closer. Jian Yao collected them like thread. She tied them in knots so they would not unravel. She took Xiaoran to school. She returned to the studio and laid out a pattern that would later be praised for its economy and warmth. Somewhere in the city, a man who made decisions like bearded judges bent his head for a breath to remember a child's laugh. And because directions have their own momentum, the day was not yet done with their small intersecting stories. A message arrived in the Gu household that read like a pebble thrown into still water.
A tip from someone who had seen the mall clip, who believed that the girl might be the one the matriarch looked for. The note suggested that the woman who had chased the child was the mother of the very girl the family was searching for. It provided a neighborhood, a description, and a sense of possibility. Madame Gu's hands tightened on the paper. The hunt that had been years in the making sharpened into something immediate. This was the exact moment she approved at her most acute, when a rumor could be treated like a seam and followed along to see whether it would hold. She informed a driver to prepare and an old friend to watch, and then she performed her favorite ritual. She sat and stared at a portrait until she could see the future in its cracks. For Jian Yao, life moved on, the laundry, the deadlines, the careful measure of food that would not make Xiao Ran ill. She did not yet know how close the matriarch's gaze had come. She did not know, as she walked the route to a bus stop, that a high-backed car with tinted windows had paused outside a bakery, and that inside it an assistant had shown a photograph and asked whether the woman in it could be found. When she crossed a busy intersection, she held Xiao Ran's hand a little tighter. The rabbit was in the child's backpack, its grin tucked safely away. The world moved with the rat-tat of its own devices, deals made in glass towers, kindness dispensed in envelopes, gossip growing where people needed a narrative. Jian Yao's car of worries did not yet include the Gu family. Her mind was occupied with what fabric would best carry a winter's warmth, and whether the meeting next week would honor the kind of sleeve she insisted upon. Her life, like her garments, was a patchwork of necessity and hope. A man who rarely smiled tucked the memory of a chase under his sternness and found it warm. It would matter later how it had lodged there, small and soft. For now, the city folded the memory into its own long, layered seams. The next days would bring more, accusations in the office, pressure from a matriarch who did not like ambiguity, and choices that required courage the way a bold stitch requires an exact hand. But before those things arrived, there was a quiet afternoon, a cup of tea cooling on a small table, and a child's breath even and calm. Stay to see what he does when he finally cracks that smile. They did not know the future yet. They knew only that the world had shifted a little, like the hem of a dress settling into a new shape. In the hours after the hospital, Jian Yao lay awake at the edge of the couch, the city outside soft and indifferent, and thought about what it meant to be watched. She thought about the kind of help that came anonymous, about the thin line between gratitude and obligation. She thought about the child who had leaned into her chest with trust so complete it made her want to weep. She arranged her tools on the table, a needle ready and a piece of cloth laid out like a small, promising map. Across town, Gu Shiyan looked at a photograph of the woman's profile and felt the odd, unmodern stir of curiosity. He had not planned to be interested in the life of a woman he had just seen in passing. But some things resist a plan. A mother's courage, offered in a small public place, had slipped past his armor and lodged where it would cause questions. He did not understand them fully yet. He only knew that he did not like leaving questions unresolved. The day folded into evening. Xiao Ran practiced a new small joke and begged for one more story.
Jian Yao told her, and her voice, in the dim light, became the only soundtrack needed. The rabbit sat nearby, redeemed and safe. The city wound around their window like a ribbon. A card with anonymous initials lay folded in the pocket of a coat and would sleep there for the night, a secret of good fortune waiting for the morning. Outside, in the Gu household, plans were already being sketched. The matriarch gathered threads of rumor the way a seamstress gathers fabric. Warriors in suits prepared to go where their mistress pointed. A family that had shaped much of the city's skyline waited to see whether this small human would fit their shape. The threads were laid. The pattern had been started. They only needed the next stitch to tell whether the garment would be a cloak of shelter or a suit of armor. The city kept spinning, indifferent and faithful, and somewhere between its towers and its crowded markets, something fragile and brave had begun to pull the world off its familiar axis. One child's toy, one mother's sprint, and one man's barely noticed smile. The threads were laid, the pattern had been started. They only needed the next stitch to tell whether the garment would be a cloak of shelter or a suit of armor. Within days, the small web of attention tightened into actions that reached across neighborhoods. A polite knock came at the design firm late one afternoon when the light slanted gold across the drafting tables, and the team was hunched over mood boards. Two men in clean suits, one with a polite smile, the other with the blank efficiency of someone trained to deliver messages, introduced themselves as representatives of a family looking into a possible kinship matter. They had a photograph in a folder, a cropped image of Zhao Ran taken from the mall clip that was faded around the edges like an old souvenir. They asked if anyone knew the child's mother. The question landed like a weight in the room. Conversations halted mid-thread. Jian Yao stood with a fabric swatch in one hand and the dyed outline of a sleeve in the other. She recognized the photograph and felt, in a way that surprised and unnerved her, the ripple of being watched. She answered simply, yes, that girl was her daughter. The men were courteous but persistent. They explained that they were acting on behalf of private clients, and that there had been rumors, official-sounding, selective words meant to imply veracity without giving it any, evidence, potential matches, a matter of family significance. Jian Yao's sense of unease hardened into a protective question. Were they asking for permission to meet the child? Were they testing the waters for a patronage that might bring help and strings? One man slid a business card across the table. The name on it read simply, Gu Family Foundation. Jian Yao's fingers tightened around the swatch until her knuckles paled. She thought of the anonymous envelope in her coat pocket and the initials G.S.
That had felt like both a blessing and a risk. She thought of the way a favor made demands of the soul. "I'll pass your message along," she said, careful, not committing to anything beyond the truth. The men left with their photograph and their professional tact. Rumors that they had been searching for the child spread faster than their polite footsteps. Manager Shen's eyebrows knitted. Someone in HR made a note on a file they later denied having touched. Lin Zhao watched the exchange with a look that could be read as pity or as calculation. The office became a small electric field in which reputation could be charged and discharged by whoever recalled a gossip with the most conviction. At the same time, inside the Gu compound, Madame Gu convened her own council. She unfolded the photograph with the sober pleasure of a woman who had been handed a possibility relevant to her labyrinthine plan. She ordered a discreet, private approach, an invitation extended to the child's mother, a polite lunch at a place where the family could observe her without appearing to observe. If the woman came willingly, the matriarch reasoned, it would be easier to assess likeness, temperament, and the social graces that, in Madame Gu's view, signaled whether a child could be brought into a family with standards to maintain. No one told Jian Yao about the plan. Everyone knew she would be wary. What Madame Gu relied upon was the currency of apparent generosity. A hand extended with the public face of help often gets closer access than one which threatens. The invitation arrived as an elegant envelope left with Assistant Li. It contained a formal note requesting that Jian Yao meet a representative of the Gu Family Foundation to discuss resources for the child's care. There was a sense of urgency, but also a civility that asked nothing overtly of the receiver. Jian Yao read it twice, then folded it and put it on the table next to the kettle. She took Xiaoran to school, answering the child's questions about her mother's odd frown with the deflection that would not alarm. "It's a meeting with someone who wants to make sure you're all right," she told the girl, which was true enough. She debated. Going could mean help that kept Xiaoran safe and well-tended. Not going could mean missing an opportunity when a child's medical bills loomed, or when work hours threatened to unspool. In the end, she chose to go. She dressed in a blouse that was clean without being showy, and left Xiaoran with a neighbor who promised to fetch her if needed. The decision felt like standing on a small bridge and looking over water. The matriarch's test was soft. Jian Yao accepted it with a guarded heart. Madame Gu greeted her with a formality that almost reached warmth. The estate salons smelled faintly of citrus and old books. A private suite was arranged. Cushions that would be judged as tasteful by any critic were placed with geometric precision.
The matriarch asked questions that were less about facts and more about provenance, family names, place of upbringing, the music children hummed when they played. She watched Jian Yao's hands while she spoke, as if hands told stories no mouth could. It was easy to talk to someone who held a pen like a weapon and a needle like prayer. But Madame Gu's tone shifted from watchful to purposeful when she spoke about likeness. "We have one or two reasons to be concerned with continuity," she said, oblique and deliberate. "It is important for a family such as ours to understand where our lines pass through." There was a formality in that sentence meant to emphasize an inherited sensibility, lineage as a duty, not as a whim. Jian Yao did not say she knew what continuity cost. She did not say how often she had been counted out by social arithmetic. She said only that Xiaoran was loved and that she would do anything for her child's safety. It was the only bargain she could make without compromising the core of herself. Outside, whispers took shape into actions. A lifestyle blogger who had once hailed the mall chase as brave now questioned the woman's motives in a morning post. Could there be an angle? Read a headline that hurt not because of its question, but because of the insinuation that quiet dignity could be counted as an investment. At the hospital, where the beep of monitors sometimes made a human heartbeat feel small, a different kind of scrutiny was underway. Xiaoran would not be left to chance. Chen, the pediatrician who had seen the girl's rattle resolve quickly with medication, recommended a more complete set of tests after the matriarch's representative mentioned potential family concerns. There was nothing improper about the suggestion. In medicine, context mattered. If there was a question of genealogy and a possibility of inherited conditions, broader testing was rational. Jian Yao signed the forms because the options in life had often been about saying yes to practicalities she did not relish. More testing because knowledge buys safety. More hours at work because rent does not wait for sentiment. The blood tests were a prick of pain and then a catalogued number in a lab. Nurses drew vials with efficient hands and labeled them with dates. The hospital faxed results, but not all results were simple. A preliminary blood group was catalogued and recorded. The basic typing came back as an ordinary grouping, nothing dramatic. But within the family, preliminary findings were enough to kindle narratives. Madame Gu received the preliminary reports with a face that contained many calculations. A blood type could rule out parentage in certain combinations, and rarely confirm it with absolute certainty. Still, for the matriarch, every small piece of paper was a thread to pull. If the results disappointed, she told herself, there were other methods. If they confirmed likeness, then the prize, however defined, drew nearer. At the design firm, the situation worsened in quiet ways. Manager Shen found a dossier of attendance slips and flung them at Jian Yao as if they were evidence on a table. "We must consider continuity," he said, parroting a phrase that had entered his vocabulary from higher corporate rooms. "Reliability is valued in clients' eyes." Jian Yao answered with the kind of economy she had cultivated. "I'm as reliable as anyone here. My child was sick. Anyone who thinks otherwise is mistaken." The conversation escalated only to a limited extent. Manager Shen had the advantage of institutional power and the ability to reassign shifts. Jian Yao had the advantage of truth and a small, stubborn reputation for work that did not need explanation. The firm saw both ethics and liability. The way it decided was not always neat. An HR representative whispered about the rumor, adding with the reckless cruelty of repetition that they had received an offer from a family wanting to assist. The rumor seduced gossip into action. Lin Zhao did not need coaxing. She took the opportunity to push for a promotion she had always believed was her due, and spoke of team cohesion as though it were a precise scale on which people could be measured. In the midst of this pressure, Gu Shiyan watched from a distance measured by dignity and detachment. He received reports, an invitation extended, a meeting held, a blood sample processed. He knew, better than most, that power could either protect the vulnerable or crush them in the name of expedience. He had learned early that decisions made to soothe a matriarch were rarely the same decisions made to secure a child's welfare. His instinct was to prevent harm, not to govern sentiment. Yet he also felt, in an unpracticed way, the tug of curiosity that made cold men place small details into a private ledger. A subtle change occurred then. Rather than intervene with grand measures, he moved by small, unobtrusive acts. He authorized an independent pediatric consultation under the name of the foundation and arranged for the specialist to review Zhao Ran's medical file. The specialist was discreet, thorough, and professional. He recommended further testing, not to determine lineage, but to ensure that no inherited condition was missed. After all, the immediate priority beyond questions of heritage was a child's health. The matriarch accepted these measures as long as they could be controlled. She insisted that all assessments be coordinated through her office and declined anything that might seem like deference to the child's mother. To her, hands that asked too many questions were the hands of someone who had not yet learned the value of discretion.
The social worker arrived with a polite manner and a sheaf of papers that bore the family's insignia. He praised Jian Yao's tenacity and offered, in the kind of language designed to disarm, a chance for the child to spend time at a place with medical supervision while tests were arranged. Jian Yao was not stupid. She knew the value of offers and the risk contained in them. She said no. She understood that the child, no matter the cost, belonged with her. The social worker, told courteously but firmly that it would not be possible, left with his papers and a quiet expression like someone who had hit a wall of a different kind of courage. It was then that Madame Gu made a sharper choice. She did not try to take the child that day. She would never openly cross a legal line when cooler options existed. Instead, she began to gather a narrative that could do the same work, a portrait of the mother as unstable, the child as a fragile vessel needing family care, and the family as magnanimous in offering that care. Her aides compiled reports, threaded with observations about the apartment's maintenance, the number of sick days Jian Yao had taken, and the plausible concern that many observers could, with a small push, read as neglect. The story reached the press in a small whisper, a mention of a child in question. The firm became a theater where loyalties were tested.
Someone placed the mall clip on a public channel with a new caption insinuating that the woman's behavior had marketing value and that perhaps she had staged the event to gain attention. The cruelty of modern rumor was surgical. When reality pushed back, it did so in the form of a single phone call, the kind that carries the sterile voice of protocol. A lawyer representing the Gu family called to say that they wished to verify the child's identity and that if Jian Yao permitted a full DNA test, it would be handled respectfully. The lawyer made it sound like custom, like something all families did in moments of possible fortune. Jian Yao had to decide if accepting would mean giving over a piece of herself to an institution whose appetite she did not trust. She declined at first, uncertain of what it meant to have her daughter's life become evidence in a family drama. Yet the pressure compounded. Whispers at work hardened into light pressure from HR that referenced continuity of care. A friend called and told her that if she refused, it might be read as obstruction, that small officials with connections could make it awkward. The fear that small children could become collateral in adult wars is a particular, private terror. Jian Yao gave in because the alternative, prolonged suspicion and the erosion of her job, seemed worse. The test was arranged at a neutral clinic with an independent lab. Jian Yao held Xiao Ran in her lap as a nurse swabbed the inside of the child's cheek.
Xiao Ran, who had laughed at the rabbit's antics a week prior, now fidgeted and asked, in her child's vocabulary, "Will this tell us who my rabbit is from?" Jian Yao smiled and told her what she always told the girl when the world asked uncomfortable questions, that the people who loved her would always be the ones who answered her name. The results took days. In the interim, gossip curled into assertions. There were messages, kindly offered, thinly veiled, that suggested Jian Yao would be safer if she accepted the Foundation's support. There were other notes that simply said, "You are brave," left as if bravery were a currency and not a shield. The company gave her a week to adjust her schedule. A client called to delay a fitting. The world around her contracted to the scale of schedules and the size of forms. When the first lab result came back, it was a small earthquake. It was not the definitive DNA everyone wanted. It was a preliminary genetic marker analysis that, through a misread in translation by the team's internal commentator, was misreported in the press as non-match. The headline, brief and implacable, declared that the child did not match the Gu lineage. For the matriarch, it was a blow. For others, it was an opportunity to brandish victory. Murmurs at the firm shifted to a tone of quiet triumph. Some used it to ratify backbiting. Others used it as proof that those who were different were indeed different and could be safely excluded. Jian Yao felt the world tilt. She had not expected a public misreading of private tests. She thought of the envelope with initials and the man with a blank face at the mall who had watched her laugh. She thought of the way power could be wielded in forms both subtle and devastating. A misreported result could destroy reputations, affect children's lives, and widen the gulf between those who had the luxury of privacy and those who did not. Gu Shiyan, who read with controlled eyes through the same briefings, did not accept the misreport. He suspected an error, not because he felt some romantic pull, but because he understood the unreliability of hastily synthesized findings. He commissioned a full, independent DNA analysis, comprehensive, meticulous, and handled by a lab with a reputation so solid it made other labs look like neighborhood shops. The Gu matriarch bristled, both because a full test would take time and because it removed the immediate pleasure of having a tidy conclusion. Yet she tolerated it. If the tests confirmed her hopes, the delay would be a price worth paying. If they did not, she would devise other maneuvers. Madame Gu believed in persistence as much as she believed in pedigree. While the labs ran, the politics of the office darkened. Lin Zhao found herself unexpectedly in the crosshairs of rumor. Her own family's past, one littered with small alliances and a history of marriages brokered with efficiency, made her vulnerable to the matriarch's attentions.
A document surfaced, an old registry that suggested a possible connection between the Lin and Gu families decades prior, an arranged engagement that had dissolved in awkward silence, a liaison that had not been fully recorded, a room of family friends who had drifted into different social strata. The discovery complicated alliances. Lin Zhao's mother, wary and pragmatic, called a family meeting to assess whether their family's name might be implicated in anything beneficially prophetic. The test results finally arrived one late rainy afternoon. The full DNA analysis showed a surprising, delicate truth. Xiao Ran was not the direct descendant of the Gu patriarch in the most simple sense, but there was a shared ancestor several generations back between the Lin and Gu branches, an extended relation that made the matriarch's hope neither wholly founded nor entirely baseless. The result was a genealogical tangle of proximity rather than immediate paternity. It was precise and unemotional. It required no hasty rejoicing. What it did do, however, was complicate the matriarch's plans. She had not expected a partial kinship. The family could claim probability, not certainty, and that ambiguity was not to Madame Gu's liking. For some, it meant disappointment. For others, it was a new way into a narrative. The Lin family, previously viewed by some as peripheral players, suddenly found themselves central to a conversation about lineage. In the middle of these maneuvers, Shiyan, who, as the Gu family's young master, had been tacitly groomed for attention and engagement, watched with undisguised discomfort. He had been told, for reasons that had included convenience and status, that an alliance might be advantageous. He had never been comfortable with marriage as a transaction. The possibility that the line of advantage might involve a woman of another social stratum made him question the moral architecture he had been raised within. At the heart of the escalating tension, Jian Yao kept her own counsel. She was tired of being reduced to a symbol. She wanted safety, steady work, and to be left in peace to raise her daughter. Yet the forces arrayed against her were not easily deterred by simple wishes. The matriarch's office began to orchestrate a public event, a banquet under the pretext of a future philanthropy initiative. It would be attended by the Gu family, important clients, and a handful of reporters who would be vetted as friendly. The guest list, however, was a chessboard in which political moves could be made under the guise of courtesy. Madame Gu expected the banquet to be the stage upon which a claim could be presented, clarified, or dismissed with poetic finality. She arranged to have a chance meeting occur, and she made sure the diners included those whose voices could complicate Jian Yao's life if they chose. The banquet would be elegant, the kind of event where a single remark could function as sword or balm.
Jian Yao received the invitation with a mixture of suspicion and dread. Declining would be interpreted as defiance or fear. Attending could thrust her into a curiosity she had not asked for. Shiyan, who had been advised by his mother, his grandmother, and the quiet pressures of family expectation to show a decorous face at the event, informed his assistant that he would attend. He did not know at the time how his presence would shift the balance of what was to come. On the night of the banquet, crystal chimed and chandeliers threw an orderly light across tables arranged like small islands. The city's elite gathered, and lines were crossed with polite laughter. The matriarch sat at the head, the family a constellation of practiced posts. When Jian Yao arrived, escorted by a representative who professed concern for her comfort, the murmurs followed. Some eyes measured, others were kinder, the look of people whose memory of the mall scene preserved a certain warmth. Jian Yao carried herself with the reserve of someone who had learned to keep her elbows tucked in order to conserve warmth. Dinner was an exercise in diplomacy. Speeches were given about charity and continuity. The matriarch's voice, always a blade wrapped in velvet, spoke of duty and beauty, and the mysterious ways families find themselves with surprises. At the end of dessert,
Just when talk risked settling into the kind of boredom that signals no small dramas, Madame Gu rose gracefully and made an announcement. She invited the mother of Xiao Ran to the stage. The room shifted. Glasses were set down like small gongs. Jian Yao found herself on a dim path of light, understanding in one pulse that she was being asked to be a symbol in a speech she did not write. The matriarch spoke of lineage in softened terms. She praised the endurance of women who held families together. Her eyes, however, had an unambiguous request threaded beneath them. "We would like," she said, "to speak frankly about a young child's well-being and the supports a family such as ours can provide." That was the opening cue she had calculated. It allowed her to suggest without outright saying it that the child might flourish better within a family that had means. It implied the sufficiency of provision and the necessity of counsel, and it invited applause for the graceless generosity of those with resources. Jian Yao felt the room shrinking. She could see Shiyan across the hall, his posture like a held breath. She could see Gu Shiyan in a corner, his face the same quiet mask it had always been, though there was now a small, inscrutable awareness in his eyes. When the matriarch finished, a gentleman at the table asked, not unkindly, whether the family would consider temporary arrangements for the child while tests were finalized. It was the same refrain in a different key. Before Jian Yao could respond, a voice rose from the center of the room, low, calm, and unmistakably familiar. It was Gu Shiyan.
He stood, and the room inclined toward him with the habit of deference. People listened the way one listens to a ledger being balanced, with an assumption that the numbers will favor the wealthy, the clever, the patient. He spoke plainly. "We will verify the genetic analysis through a respected independent lab," he said, acknowledging the testing that had already been done. "Until then, there will be no decisions made that affect the child's placement outside of the mother's guardianship." The matriarch's hand tightened imperceptibly on her napkin. The room, trained to read the matriarch's will as law, felt a small rupture. If Gu Shiyan had sided with caution, the matriarch's theatrical plan could be postponed. Her expression, for a moment, showed a private, contained displeasure, but she was not the kind of woman to be undone by a single voice. Instead, she narrowed her eyes into a domestic blade. "We only wish for what's best," she said, with the dryness of someone who believed their scale was the only one that mattered. The banquet's air shifted. Someone behind the matriarch muttered about propriety. Critics wanted to celebrate the family's magnanimity. Others suspected a different currency at play. For Jian Yao, the relief was immediate and complicated. Gu's restraint had bought her a reprieve, but it had also moved the pressure onto other terms. The corporate rumor mill would whirl on, the lab results would be used as bullets by one side or the other, and the matriarch's offense at being contradicted would need to find other outlets. It would be wrong to claim Gu's intercession was a romantic gesture. It was not. It was the action of a man who understood that the most immediate injustice, an illegal removal of a child, would create more damage than any political advantage. Still, for Jian Yao, the moment felt like a bridge built across a minor gulf of dignity. The matriarch did not relent. When the guests retired to the garden for coffee, she drew Gu aside in a small balcony. The words they exchanged were not overheard clearly, but the tilt of the matriarch's posture told the story she meant to tell, that the family had options, and that she intended to pursue all of them. Gu's answer was small and controlled. "We will wait for the full results and act in accordance with the law." The matriarch left with a simulated smile and a private fury tempered into long-term strategies. In the quiet after the event, a more dangerous gambit occurred. That night, while guests departed and small conversations folded into the city's night, someone in Madame Gu's inner circle leaked a photograph to a popular blogger. The photograph was taken from a drone, grainy and invasive, and showed Jian Yao walking alone in a park with Xiao Ran. The caption suggested that the child's living conditions might be inadequate. The post spread, comments poured in.
It was an ugly reminder that in the modern world, privacy could be shredded by anyone with an appetite for spectacle. For a brief, terrible hour, the online crowd judge passed verdicts as if voting in a game. People who never met Jian Yao wrote with righteous fury or performative compassion, dividing into camps that felt nostalgic for purity or keen for dissent. Someone at the firm's HR forwarded the link to the management team with a calm note. PR may want to respond. Jian Yao felt the walls press in. It was one thing to have wealthy people debate her fate in polished rooms. It was another to have strangers decide if her love was underqualified. She found a hollow steadiness in articulating her own truth. She loved her child. She worked hard. She would not be intimidated into yielding her daughter as a chess piece. It was at this low point that something else happened, a private kindness that was small but consequential. Gu Shiyan, who had instructed the independent lab and could have left matters there, took an action that was not public relations driven. He arranged for the foundation to quietly cover the cost of an emergency care fund beyond the immediate hospital bills. A durable stroller, an at-home nebulizer, a small scholarship that would ensure even if Jian Yao needed extra hours to recover from a sudden medical visit, the child's care would be maintained. The help arrived with no press release, just an anonymous transfer and a short note that read, "For your child's care, with respect." Jian Yao held the note in her palm and felt a complex mix of gratitude and wariness. It was relief, yes. It was also another way in which the family could extend power into her life. At the same time, the Lin family, scrambled by the partial DNA linkage, made their own move. They reached out to Shiyan with a proposition. If their daughter, Zhao Zhao, were to align herself with the Gu family through marriage, the child's peculiar partial kinship could be resolved into a strategic alliance. The plan, transactional and delicate, was forwarded through channels that spoke the language of strategy, not heart. Shiyan, however, felt uneasy. He had not imagined his life as a place where children's futures could be led by spreadsheets. He had been raised to think about legacy. He had not imagined its human cost. The climax of the conflict, true to the patterns of old dramas and new tabloid appetites, arrived in a sudden rush. The matriarch, impatient with a full wait for the conclusive lab results, orchestrated a public spectacle. She called a press statement asserting that the family would act in the child's best interest. What she meant, less explicitly, was that the family's resources would be used to ensure a life she considered proper for the child. The statement was laced with philanthropy. Reporters hungry for sensation smelled opportunity. The press release was a trap wearing velvet.
Jian Yao, surprised by the announcement and sensing the potential for her child to be made into a property of public debate, refused to be cowed. She appeared at a small press area, hand on Yan Ron's shoulder, and spoke, simply, honestly, and without the benefit of a prepared script, a legal, transparent process. But I will not accept that her life be bargained like a good at auction. We will follow the law, and we will protect what is ours. Her words did something important. They reframed the debate from one about lineage to one about caregiving. Families watching at home felt the human weight of a mother who fought with the kind of dignity that had nothing to do with wealth. Their sympathy moved, not because they knew Jian Yao, but because the scene recalled universal instincts, that a child's safety belongs to the one who tends the child daily.
The matriarch, affronted, escalated by attempting to arrange a private evaluation of the child's home by social services. The move was legal in appearance, but coercive in intent. She presented her team of legal counsel and domestic advisors as necessary assessors, people who would vouch for the best environment for a child linked to a major family. There was a tension between law and power. Legally, social services could assess, but they needed a just cause. The matriarch used influence to push for an expedited review. When the social workers arrived at Jian Yao's apartment, they were professional and precise. They reviewed receipts, spoke with neighbors, and observed a life that was indeed small in material terms, but abundant in care. They saw a kitchen where a daughter braided hair without complaint, a bookshelf of borrowed picture books, a child's drawings tacked to a wall. They listened to Jian Yao speak about schedules and about a child's favorite game. The social workers' reports became a testament to competent care. A formal evaluation found no immediate cause to strip parental rights or even to suggest a change in guardianship. Madame Gu interpreted this as a loss, and she took an unwise step. In private frustration, one of her aides attempted to seize an opportunity. They organized a temporary, voluntary visit in which they would bring Yan Ran to the Gu compound for a medical observation, presented as part of a philanthropic gesture. The intent was to show in public that the family could provide the best care while the test results were awaited. Legally, they planned to secure parental consent signed under what they called assurance conditions. It was a maneuver that relied upon the mother's exhaustion and the public's appetite for spectacle. Jian Yao, wary to the core, refused to sign anything that could be construed as relinquishing custody, even temporarily.
She insisted any medical appointment must be accompanied by clear written consent and the presence of a licensed social worker. She demanded transparency, not favors hidden behind golden veneers. The matriarch's aide, impatient, tried to press the advantage by offering gifts and promises. Shiyan, involved at this point and seeing the manipulation firsthand, stepped in. It was a tense, contained confrontation. Shiyan had been on the margins of the drama until then, more observer than actor. But in the moment, a well-meaning aide tried to hand Xiaoran a toy and suggest a play date that would keep the child at the estate for observation. Shiyan saw something he could not tolerate. He spoke plainly to the aide. "You cannot take a child like a sample," he said. "If you want to help, do it properly. Ask the mother first." The aide's face flushed with embarrassment. The matriarch watched the exchange and felt a type of familial irritation at being contradicted by younger voices. In the kitchen of the estate, a small war of wills aged into an open disagreement. The aide rationalized urgency. Shiyan insisted on the simple decency of asking for consent. The matter escalated only to the degree of a heated conversation, but it signaled that the family's unity had a fracture. That fracture widened when the matriarch attempted a more direct tactic. She arranged for certain employees of the foundation to start a campaign praising the benefits of security and how families with means could stabilize a child's future. It was an attempt to remake public opinion. It backfired when people noted the arrogance of presuming that wealth equated to moral authority. The backlash mounted. The story became more complicated and less easily consumable as a neat charity headline. All the while, the labs processed data and returned results that remained ambiguous in part. Links, not clear lineage. The matriarch responded with alternate strategies. She consulted family records, summoned distant relations for interviews, and looked for any document that could be used as proof of sustained kinship. The family's lawyers prepared for a survey of possibilities that included guardianship petitions, philanthropic arrangements, and strategic marriages. Their machinery was efficient and merciless in the abstract. Jian Yao, present always in a quieter way, kept doing the work that had saved her day after day, drawing patterns, meeting deadlines, comforting a child who occasionally asked if the rabbit would always be safe. She began to find uneasy allies, people who had watched the mall clip and saw in it not a publicity stunt, but an honest act. A few colleagues who felt ashamed at how they had once joked, a young journalist who had been moved by Jian Yao's single sentence at the press area and who wanted to dig for a story that honored the complexity of the human cost.
They offered practical help, a crowdfunding page to cover medical bills, a public letter supporting her motherhood, and a small legal fund for consultations. The matriarch, watching the slow accumulation of public sympathy for Jian Yao, tried dampening measures, controlled releases of archival photos showing the guileful benefits of pedigree, a careful leak about an old family dispute to muddy the waters. Yet each attempt invited more scrutiny. The public, unwilling to accept a simple narrative, began to split. Some continued to champion the Gu family's patronage, believing that their resources meant security. Others saw the attempt to extract a child into the interstices of public drama as an abuse of power. The next high point came in the form of an event that would have consequences for relationships far older than the present scandal. A distant relative of the Gu family, an elderly woman who had been a friend to Jian Yao's mother years ago, came forward in the name of truth. She claimed in no uncertain terms that she remembered an incident decades earlier. A young woman of a modest background had lent service to the Gu household and been dismissed under odd circumstances. The elder's memory twined with records that suggested a liaison between families, blurry with time, which might account for the partial kinship the lab had found. It was a crack in the matriarch's tidy narrative. For the matriarch, the testimony was exasperating. For others, including Lin Zhao's family, it was an opening to rethink alliances. The Lin family stepped forward with documents that proved distant but relevant ties to the Gu branch, birth records, registry entries, and a faded letter that hinted at a connection born of circumstance and then denied by social force. The letter was not conclusive. It was a human artifact that suggested history could be messy. The matriarch's carefully constructed logic of lineage, so confident in its absolutes, had to face a truth the world rarely prefers. The past was not a single narrative, but many, and many of them overlapped. In the small legal enclave that had been preparing contingency plans, a lawyer advised against any sweeping move to remove the child. The law, she said bluntly, protected parental rights unless clear evidence of neglect or danger was presented. The matriarch, who had been relying on discretion, recognized the limits of what could be done without inciting legal reprisals and public scandal. She adjusted plans, moving into a longer game that would involve the court system, careful negotiations, and perhaps a marriage that would solve more problems than it created. It was at this point that Shiyan, caught in the lurch between family duty and personal moral discomfort, made a choice that surprised everyone. He went to speak with Jian Yao, not as a representative, not as a diplomat for an old house, but as a man who had been given the chance to see her in the small ordinances of life.
He asked for nothing dramatic. He offered, in a voice that had been steadied by observation rather than impulse, a suggestion that the family back away from coercion and allow the law and humane practicalities to lead the way. Jian Yao, tired and wary but also quietly grateful for any ally, listened. She appreciated the decency of a man who did not want to weaponize paternal prestige. The meeting was simple: coffee at a place close to the firm, a short exchange about boundaries and fairness. Shiyan's manner revealed more than his words. He looked tired of performance and eager for a mode of action that preserved dignity for everyone involved. It was a gesture of solidarity, thinly spoken but meaningful in its steadiness. Then the final public confrontation occurred, not in the ornate ballroom Madame Gu preferred, but at a hearing in a municipal room where papers were filed and judges read lines with the patience of professionals accustomed to domestic dramas. The matriarch's lawyers sought to file an accelerated petition for temporary guardianship on the grounds of immediate interest in the child's welfare pending full confirmation of lineage. Jian Yao's lawyer, supported quietly by funds from sympathetic donors, argued for parental rights and for the dignity of not being a commodity in anyone's family ledger. It was a legal duel of wills framed in a language that did not capture the tenderness at the center of a child's life. When the judge asked for testimony, the matriarch spoke with practiced clarity about duty and family. Jian Yao spoke about the daily rituals that made a child whole, bedtime stories, scraped knees treated with attention, a mother's hands that knew the precise way to braid hair. The social worker's independent report that had found no neglect carried weight. The judge, who had seen many such cases, weighed the facts and the law and concluded with a quiet, careful decree. No temporary change of custody would be enacted without overwhelming evidence of harm. The case would proceed with full tests and with the consideration of all parties, but the immediate proposal to place the child outside parental guardianship was denied. Madame Gu, who had expected to wield influence like a chisel, felt the immediate loss like a narrow, stinging rebuke. She left the courtroom like a woman who had not been wholly defeated, but who had encountered a boundary. Her mind moved to longer strategies. She had the patience to wait. Yet the matriarch's authority had been publicly questioned by the law, and to her private fury, by the small civil servant's insistence that a child's best interest was not always synonymous with family legacy. After the hearing, there was a small private scene that mattered as much as any headline. Shiyan stepped into the corridor where Jian Yao stood with a hand on her daughter's small shoulder.
He did not make an announcement or allow a camera. He spoke in the kind of low voice that belonged to someone removing a weight from a shelf. "I arranged for this hearing to be fair," he said simply, "not for show, for the child's sake." Jian Yao felt in that utterance the odd relief of a person who had been watched and judged, and then confirmed by a measured act. She did not know how to accept what felt like favor without owing something, and Gu knew that. He did not press it into a gesture of dominance. Instead, he offered a pragmatic assurance. The foundation would fund a small support program for children like Xiao Ran in the neighborhood, a way to help that was not about claims on families, but about community resources. It was a policy that, in the hands of those who had lived with the power to give, and with it the responsibility to be gentle, could make a genuine difference. That night, after the hearing, and after the day's press had calmed into a low thrum, Jian Yao sat with Xiao Ran in the couch in their apartment. The child drew pictures of rabbits with long journeys and little notes that read, in childish scrawl, "For Mom and the man who smiled." Jian Yao's hands trembled as she pinned one of the drawings to the wall. The world had been noisy and cruel, and sometimes kind in strange, anonymous ways. She had held on to the small truths she knew, her daughter's laugh, the precise way her child slept, and those truths had been enough to protect them that day. Shiyan, in the privacy of his own study, reflected on the way the mall chase had lodged like a foreign coin under his sternness. The smile he had given in that small public moment had not been a policy, it had been something like recognition. It had made him notice the ways in which life could brutalize people quietly, and the ways in which simple acts of courage revealed character. He had acted not to be magnanimous, but to prevent harm.
He had used his influence to ensure due process instead of theatrics, to convert an impulsive sympathy into structural assistance. That, in his view, was the honorable course. The matriarch was slower to adjust. She had always believed in precise resolutions, but the law demanded patience, and the court had asked for proof beyond spectacle. Her plan of coercion barked and yielded to precedent. She retreated to long-game options, alliances via marriage, soft builds of public opinion, acquisitions of influence by convincing charitable institutions to align with her view of family uplift. She did not disappear, she adjusted. The days grew into weeks. Work resumed at the firm, though the small tremors of rumor did not vanish entirely. Manager Shen eased his tone, chastened perhaps by a courtroom's example. Lin Zhao's complicity in gossip left her with a private sting that made her reconsider the casual cruelty of rumor. A few colleagues offered apologies in private messages, others stayed silent.
A tender web of human smallness continued to hum beneath the machine. Full DNA analysis, performed with the scientific care demanded by such matters, offered a final, nuanced picture. Zhao Ran was not a direct heir to the Gu patriarch in the immediate sense that Madame Gu had hoped. However, there was a distant kinship traceable through an old marriage and a lineage that had splintered across social strata. The tests concluded what many had already suspected, if they had allowed complexity. Family is often messy, and legal pedigree rarely measures the actual love and labor that raise a child. When the results were read publicly, without ceremony, in a statement prepared carefully by counsel, the matriarch found herself having to accept a world without the tidy dominion she preferred. She swallowed the loss and shifted her energies to projects that preserved family honor without sacrificing legal boundaries. Jian Yao, on the other hand, found in the finality an odd release. The world would not consume her daughter because of a misbided hunger for heirship. The mother who had chased bullies in a mall for a small toy could rest, for now, in the knowledge that her daughter's life would remain with her. In the months that followed, life settled into a different rhythm. The foundation, the same one that had been the instrument of anxious advances, funded a community center to support single parents. It was named modestly. It offered pediatric checkups, childcare subsidies, and legal assistance for parents navigating bureaucracies. The gesture was practical, and it was useful. Jian Yao accepted a role as one of the community mentors, a paid position that allowed her to continue her design work while offering stability for her daughter. It was not the grandeur of an offer to join a family. It was a pragmatic way to ensure income and to create distance from the matriarch's ambitions. Shiyan, who had watched the battles with a young man's distaste for games played with human lives, found his own small courage changing him. He became involved in the Foundation's outreach in a quiet way, asking for policies that protected autonomy rather than provinces. He spoke with colleagues and family members about centering consent and recognizing the dignity of caregivers. His choices did not erase the pressure he had been born into, but they softened him. He began to think about the possibility of a life lived with less of his family's scripted merits and more personal compassion. As for the matriarch, she hardened and softened in equal measures. She remained someone who believed in their family's stewardship of an old legacy, but she also recognized that blunt force in the modern age invited legal and public rebuke. She turned to philanthropy as a way to cement prestige that could not be used to seize children. In private, she watched Jian Yao with a mixture of regret and reluctant respect. She began to understand that character could not be purchased, and that courage was not a quality that answered to pedigree.
One afternoon, in a scene small and human, the moment that title promised finally completed its cycle. Jian Yao brought Xiaoran to a small celebration at the community center, the center the foundation had funded, where children wore paper crowns and adults shared food. The room smelled of warm bread and the faint tang of craft glue. Xiaoran ran through the activities, her laughter a repeated bell. She tugged at her mother's sleeve and asked for another turn on the swing. Jian Yao watched her in the way mothers watch, with a mixture of fierce protectiveness and gratefully mundane delight. Gu Shiyan had been invited to speak at the center about the importance of community healthcare, a part of the quiet work he had taken on. He arrived not to perform but to observe. In the line of children, one small hand clutched a stuffed rabbit, one that had been given at a previous event. The little girl made a joke to her friend about the rabbit having seen a palace, and the children laughed in a way that echoed the mall's earlier kindness. Gu, seated at a corner table, watched the small choreography. He saw Jian Yao lifting a child onto a swing, the simple efficiency of her movements, the two infants of expression on her face that combined fatigue and joy. The smile that finally crossed his face was small, not a dramatic concession, but a thaw. It was not a brand new emotion, it was an acknowledgement that in the world decisiveness and tenderness could coexist. Someone near him felt the change and looked up. The smile rested at his mouth like a half-remembered melody. For a man who had been unnoticeable in joy for 2 decades, it was both tiny and extraordinary. It was not the end of the story. It was not a miraculous healing of all wounds. It was a beginning, a softening that made room for action, not apology. Jian Yao saw the movement of his mouth across the room. She did not over-interpret it. Her life had taught her to take small mercies and fold them into the daily fabric. The smile, destabilizing an old idea, sent through her a quiet astonishment that a man whose face had once seemed constructed for the hardness of business could find something to acknowledge in a mother's courage. She felt neither conquest nor triumph, but recognition. Someone had noticed what courage looked like when it was simply loving a child. The days that followed were filled with gradual, practical reconciliations. The Foundation's community center thrummed with regular classes. Jian Yao's income stabilized, not because she had been absorbed by a family, but because institutions, companies, foundations had learned a modest lesson about responsibility. Lin Zhao, chastened by the experience, reached out to apologize. Some of the firm's colleagues offered small gestures of repair. Manager Shen, chastened by the legal precedent he'd nearly created, altered scheduling policies to be more accommodating. The matriarch continued to watch. She had not been defeated. She had been asked by the law and by public opinion to act within limits. She began to channel her energy into endowments, into the shaping of public projects that bore her family's name, but not at the expense of others. It was not a surrender of principle, it was a recalibration. As for Jian Yao, she learned that while courage could be visible on a moment in a mall, the sustained courage required for daily life was quieter and more resilient. She continued to design with the same careful hands, measured by a client who appreciated her work for its warmth. Her name on a garment label began to signify a line that married economy with comfort. It was not celebrity, but it was respect. Xiaoran grew in a world buffered by that respect and by the community center's resources that ensured a doctor's visit would never be a moral hazard on their plate. Shiyan and Gu Shiyan continued to act as stewards rather than saviors. They learned that what mattered was less about claiming heirs and more about ensuring systems did not make children into instruments. They found small ways, employment opportunities, program funding, educational scholarships, to invest in structural changes that did not require the submergence of an individual's dignity. The last scene of consequence occurred on a rain-soft morning when the city smelled of wet pavement and the balcony of a small cafe caught sunlight between the clouds. Gu Shiyan met Jian Yao there, not as a patron, but as someone who wanted to deliver a practical kindness. He placed a card on the table, no initials, no hint of grandeur, and told her the foundation would continue to fund programs that supported single parents in neighborhoods where resources were scarce. The gesture was a pledge, not a claim. Jian Yao folded the card and looked at him. 1,000 words could be read into the small exchange: gratitude, wariness, acknowledgement. She thanked him without dramatics and said what she always said when offered something she needed on her own terms: "We will take help when it does not come with chains." He nodded. He had learned that lesson in the courtrooms and in the quiet of a mother's insistence. There was a respect that could not be measured in announcements or headlines, only in the steadiness of policy that did not make people pawns. He had, in his unassuming way, begun to move the foundation toward that ethic. Later, when her daughter ran ahead to another PlayStation, Jian Yao watched Gu Shiyan's face as if cataloging an artifact. The little smile he had shown months earlier had given permission to something gentler in his expressions. It did not erase his past or hers. It simply signaled that a man could be more than the sum of his public persona. Their lives did not end in the tidy bliss of a melodrama.
There remained lawsuits to be closed, reputations to be mended, and nights when Jian Yao lay awake worrying about bills and stitches and the next day's deadlines. But there was also more breathing room. The city, the same indifferent engine of commerce and kindness it had always been, had made a small space in which a child's rabbit could be found and a mother's dignity could be defended without turning into a spectacle. Sometimes the smallest things carry the most meaning: a mother running after bullies to retrieve a toy, a child clutching a rabbit, a man who had not smiled in